Step one.
It's supposed to be wireless, the one that's up there. He's wireless.
Everything is off.
Are we still getting the... Test 1, 2, test. So I'm going to be webmaster. So the way it takes it. That's what it was. What's up?
What's up, buddy? How are you?
Great.
Thanks for putting all this together. Oh my god.
Yeah, we're trying.
I'm Kyle.
Kyle. Well, nice to meet you. Thank you guys, man. Ron, what you say, man?
We're
hanging in there, man.
He's got the best camera in this room.
No, they got the new and improved model. This one's old like I
We're
am.
trying.
Yeah, right.
But I'll let you know right now, their internet here is super, super slow.
Is it? Okay.
So we're trying as best as we can to get it out. It'll definitely be out. The audio's good. But we're going to record you guys an HD version too.
So even if we need to upload it later, then it'll still be a video tape.
Correct.
Okay.
So you guys, that's what I talked to John Dawson before too, and that was the plan.
Yeah.
Depending on how bad it is afterwards, you guys just re-upload it. So this way people can still listen and watch live and stuff. This just might be a little choppy, but
that's awesome.
I mean, it is what it is. They told us they were going to have 10 gig internet, which or 35 megs. So it's
You need to
dramatically
get that once we install your utilities high speed.
Oh, that's what, yeah, hopefully. So
Will you take down the slides until they talk?
we have no control over that. That's all down there. We have them back here though, ready to go for us.
When you say them?
I got one question.
Yes, sir.
If you want to ask questions, is there a sign-up sheet for that?
No, I'll make sure you get to ask your question. Absolutely, 100%. Everybody else did.
Yeah, no problem. If you want, I'll sit.
Yeah, that looks
Would you do me a favor and just have them take that down until?
Yeah, I don't know who's controlling that. I'm thinking it's somewhere on that computer.
Okay. Is there an AV person from IB Tech?
There was. But it might take it for something. It must take it.
I did that on my presentation. Well, no, but here's the thing. I always ask people, whenever when I had writers, I always said, if you're talking to a woman and you're going to refer her on the second reference, ask her if she wants Ms., Mrs., Miss, or whatever. They let them know that we do use her as a title. They get the pick. And that's not done. That's what we used to do. That's what I used to do. Well, but it's so funny when they talk about it. Well, but it's so funny when they see certain words. It's like, you know what I mean? I'm like, oh my God.
Well, you could say reverend.
I mean, but it just seemed funny that, or the people, they're just the bad people. It is just kind of funny. I know, but it's funny to see that. Oh yeah, well, no, but isn't that more of a respect thing than a, I mean, not a respect thing, but a decorum, protocol.
So this is choppy. Really bad. You have some control over it. It's the internet.
Yeah, it's whatever they got. It's just people are looking down right now. Shut out. It asked me that.
Correct.
Really?
Right. I didn't get it was rolled. I already did line alert, so it's what it is. The problem that we had with the audio was I was picking up from the laptop.
Oh, okay.
Otherwise,
it's not yes, ma'am.
Got that.
So if they're talking, we want to hide it.
If we do, we're gonna want to use that camera. I'll tell you what, Kyle, you want to run a camera? Can you go use that camera in the corner? You might have to move the sound and get it and just follow the people talking, but like don't follow them. Just make sure that they're in the shot. Give us a second, or like get it in the shot, and then we'll switch to your camera. But once you got them in the shot, just keep it there.
Zoom in.
Zoom in, pan, but don't keep panning with them once you're in the shot. Do that because I don't want to get people motion sick.
Okay, if I could have everybody's attention, please. That's this mic out a little bit. First and foremost, thanks to everyone for coming. And my name is Del Weldon. I'm the city attorney for the city of Lawrenceburg. And on behalf of the city of Warrensburg, on behalf of the mayor's office and the city councilmen that are here in attendance, Warrensburg Municipal Utilities, and some of the other city officials, we are grateful that we were able to gather all into one room all of the people that are necessary to answer the public's questions. And so first and foremost, the purpose of today's meeting is to have the people who have the answers to your questions, you the citizens of Warrensburg, you the citizens of Dearborn County, to gather them into one room and allow your questions to be asked and answered. In addition to that, and I know there was another story on Eagle today, that this was a published closure plan meeting.
This microphone is off.
For ELT. That's also true. And so ELT will go through some of the things that they originally intended to cover in this meeting. However, once there became information that was disseminated to the public, we knew that it was our responsibility to make sure that all of the information was accurately disseminated to the public. That is our duty as elected officials, and that's our duty to the 5,000 in Lawrenceburg, the 50,000 in Dearborn County, and all of southeastern Indiana. Make no mistake, our water is our most precious commodity, and we work on a daily basis to protect that. And so during the course of tonight's presentation, you'll learn just what that means, and the good news is you won't have to take my word for it. We were able to, by the efforts of a great number of people, again, to whom we are all very grateful, we were able to organize a great group here that will be able to answer all of your questions. I've circulated an agenda, and I'm also thankful to the parties that are here for allowing me to moderate. I felt, and Mayor Milan felt, that was the most appropriate way to handle this meeting, because really this meeting again is for you. We're in the audience with you, looking up at ELT, Tanner Creek LLC, looking up at IDEM, and asking the same questions that the public has asked over the last couple of weeks. However, this is not a new process, and we've been asking these questions ever since this property transitioned from a power plant to what it is now, which is a property in the midst of being remediated and prepared for hopefully a future use. And just briefly, to go through the history, and we've done this before with the fly ash issue, but to go through the history, obviously this property that we're talking about is approximately 700 acres, located just to the west of us here on the Ohio River within Lawrenceburg proper. And this property served as a power plant, which began its operation in 1951. And so from 1951 until approximately 2015, when it was decommissioned, this was an active coal-fired power plant, which means that on site here at this location, we were generating power and energy for the region by use of burning coal and by use of coal energy. Now, the knowledge that I have is very basic in order to assist the people I work for, which is the mayor, the administration, the you citizens. These guys have much more in-depth knowledge, but essentially there are 3 ponds and 1 dry landfill located on the property. And the purpose of those locations or holes is to take the boiler sludge, the fly ash, the flue ash that is a natural byproduct of this process, and to remove them and store them. And so that's been something that's been going on since the plant opened, again in 1951. The process is rather complicated, but in essence, the fly ash, flue ash was taken out of the stacks. It was put into these ponds. It was kept wet, and then it was dried out and was placed into the land. So that's kind of generally the process. When you hear fly ash and flue ash, you hear boiler sludge, you hear about these certain materials, that's what we're talking about. So these are materials that have been created and stored on this site here since 1951, and up until 2015. In 2015, the power plant itself was decommissioned, and then that property eventually became owned by ELT, CDC, Tanner Creek LLC. And the folks from that company are here again today to answer your question. They took over ownership of this property in their capacity as a firm that does this for a living, that goes on site with property that has been used for power plants and things like this, sites that need remediation, that have potentially harmful materials, and remediates them, makes them safe, prepares them for future use. Obviously, as soon as that occurred, so our administration, I'm an appointed official, these guys are elected officials, but our administration began 2 years ago, and so it kind of lined up with ELT taking over this property and beginning to remediate it. And from day one, we were very interested in making sure that this project was done in the best way, the most appropriate way, and the safest way for our citizens, to protect the water, to protect the soil, to protect the air, and that has been and always will be our number one concern. So how do we do that? Well, we rely on our ability to create a relationship with IDEM, first and foremost. And so IDEM is the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. They have been tasked by the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, to monitor all aspects of the activity at the power plant site. And they have been while it's an active site and as it sits now in this remediation process. And one of the great resources that we have is their IDEM's virtual file cabinet, where you can look online, you can track permits that are applied for, inspections that occur, testing that is done, and these are numbers that speak for themselves. And that's a big emphasis that we have. Again, we don't want you to hear anything from us. We want you to hear from the experts. We want you to hear from the people that are tasked by the state government and the federal government to make sure that the environment is safe. So that has been our understanding from the beginning, and to that end, we have created, established, and continue to have a strong relationship with IDEM to make sure that this property is being handled in the safest, most responsible way possible. As you all know, and as you're aware, ELT has entered into what's called an option contract with Ports of Indiana, which is a part of the state of Indiana's government, where the state of Indiana is doing due diligence to inspect this property to determine whether or not the fourth port, there are 3 ports currently in Indiana, whether or not the 4th port can be built on this property. And the purpose of an option contract is to be able to decide during a period, most often a year, whether or not that sale should be completed, and give you the ability to do that without it being sold to someone else. So that's where they are in that process, and to that end, we've kept created, maintained a strong relationship with Ports of Indiana, Governor Holcomb's staff, NDOT, the Indiana Department of Transportation, really anybody that Mayor Milan has felt could assist us in our goal, which is to make sure that if a port is created here, if, not when, that it is done to the standards and specifications that most benefit the local residents, not the state of Indiana, not the region, but in terms of roads, in terms of the environment, in terms of jobs, in terms of taxes. Mayor Milan has fought staunchly to make sure that the local voice, the county and the city, comes first place. And he's done that. I know he's done that because I've seen him do that. I know that because I've seen him at the drop of a hat drive to Indianapolis to take care of some issues. And we'll talk about that later in the program. Again, I just want to give an overview of what we're going to talk about today. That is where we are, and that's where we'll remain. Like I said, this is not a new process for us. We started this process 2 years ago, and this process does not end tonight.
overnight, so we got 515, 520, about 30 feet above the 100-year flood. The top of the ash surface itself is about 20 feet above the 100-year flood. So it is elevated for where it is, where we live at, for the 100-year flood elevation. Where we are today, we've taken on this pond with the water, the ash. We've done some regrading to promote surface water runoff to support stability. All this runoff now is still captured and discharged back through permanent, so we continue to comply with the various monitoring obligations that we have. So the design work, question? Sure. It's our understanding that the way this was completed with the perimeter dikes were all clay. The main ash pond itself, the perimeter dikes were raised with fly ash ponds. From our understanding of the work, it's all. We are lining, when I get into the lining aspect, we are putting the liner all the way down across the outside perimeter dikes. There is a portion on the top that has a bottom ash portion of it, but all of this, the extent of the liner goes down and across to the lower dike. Correct. There's a bottom ash and the top and the upper dike. I mean, that's understanding that the bottom ash is on the upper dikes. On the upper dike. The liner. Some of the dikes we really let me try to work with this. Fly ash pond has a low dike. I'm going to just built up, put it up. The extent of the lower lining system goes into the low dike. Everything, all of the ash that was put into this pond is within the line. Here's what our plans are. Our capping system is going to go around the entire top of the fly ash pond, down the perimeter of that upper dike, and tie in beyond the liner below. The extent of our liner, extent of our cap is going to go beyond into that, go through the existing swale between two dikes into the outer dike. That's fine. So we have, I mean, the engineering work that we went through, obviously we went through a phased approach to control surface water runoff. This was in order to be able to close this facility with a construction sequence of engineering analysis that were completed, slope stability, liquefaction, settlement analysis, cover system stability. These are all required elements for a closure plan. All of this is being completed. And then the closure system itself is going to be a multi-layer system. Cover soil 6 inches, which can support vegetation, followed by 30 inches of protected soil, which is 3 feet total. And then a drainage layer underneath that. And then underneath that, again, there's an impervious cap. And that's, depending on where we are on the system itself, it's going to be a 40 or 60 minutes, which is again about a quarter inch. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, your aquifer water table fluctuates. You know, the river or the high water. You have a line of meters from, anywhere you got a hole in that, like at the bottom, the fluctuation in your water table, will that come into play? One of my concerns is too, like, when you drop the towers, you know, like you do all the vibration.
Sure.
How did you take the foundations out?
The foundations out?
Yeah.
Where that's in the deep
So
construction.
jackhammer one like.
Yeah, where that's part of that work is still coming.
I thought that would be a lot of vibration in the ground, and I wonder how that would affect your line and all that. You know, like you put a lot of vibration in the ground, and they wouldn't take much of a hole. I was just relieved.
Part of this design work, both with the liquefaction and the settlement analysis, deals with that from a seismic standpoint. So all of that, we installed within the pond itself a series of. First, let me go back to the first part of your question. The liner itself is substantially higher than the groundwater table. When they built this pond, it's substantially higher than the groundwater table.
I was referring to if there's a leak anywhere.
If there's a leak, obviously in the liner,
Not just on the bottom, but anywhere within the water table itself is fluctuating.
in the liner itself, sure, if there's a leak, there's a leak. I mean, that's part of our, that'll be part of the post-closure obligation, which I'll get into, where we're going to install groundwater monitoring around the entire facility and monitor it for 30 years.
And the biggie is like, I've seen problems like, you know, great plan, but implementation of the plan, like quality construction or something like that, like, I've seen drain lines on homes messed up, sewer lines, leak beds, because they ran over with equipment and mashed your pipe, brand new. So, I mean, is there any warranty of that kind of?
Further on, when we construct the cap, in understanding that the most critical element to the closure, excuse me? I'm sorry.
About being a perfect implementation.
Yes. There is, we have an obligation in front of us. It's called a Construction Quality Assurance Quality Control Plan, which an independent engineer has to oversee the construction and all the lining and all the welding and do all the testing. And that has to be done by an independent engineering, and then that becomes part of the closure design report. But the original part of your question, that's one of the critical elements of a cap in any type of system like this, is to prevent infiltration, further infiltration of water into that ash. And by doing that, then you minimize, obviously, any leakage that'll come out.
Do you think vibration from the remediation process will affect that line?
I do not.
What do you figure, how thick is that liner?
The liner is 60 mil liner is about 1/4 inch to a little less than that. But to answer your question, these specific liners are chosen for use extensively in landfills around the world because they do allow for settlement. The cap that's being used on this particular ash pond is one of the most extensive cap designs that we've had put in place on an ash pond. It's similar to what you would see on a municipal landfill, which sees far more settlement vibrations than this ash pond ever will. It's very overbuilt. So the settlement concern, things like that, again, they're way overcompensated for. And to address the water, as you brought up and Russ tried to address, the cap on top of the landfill will prevent water from getting in. And since you're no longer going to have water getting into the ash, water will not come out as well. I mean, that's the art of our technology right now. So I mean, that's the design we're looking at. You're talking about the complete cap. The extent of the cap, which we talked about briefly, is going to run the entire ash pond down the upper bank side slope and then beyond the extent of the liner underneath. So it's a full encapsulation.
Hey Russ, if I could interrupt for just a second. Our recording equipment is not able to pick up the audience questions, so if it's okay if we could keep those, and then I'll bring a microphone around and make sure that everyone gets a chance to ask their questions at the conclusion, just so it's on microphone that's being recorded.
Sure.
Thank you.
What we're trying to present here is just a kind of give you an idea of a cross-sectional view, a little bit of close-up of what exactly this design that we're intending to install will include. And again, you'll see on this is you've got the top of the ash going from the bottom to the top. You have your impervious 60 mil LLDP and HDP is high density polyethylene. Those are geomembrane liners. On top of that, to further further move any kind of precipitation or rainwater away from the liner, we have to install what's a geocomposite drainage net, which is basically a layer of material that transmits water. So water that from rainfall that infiltrates through the soil, hits that drainage layer, and then that is also taken away from the top of the liner. And then you have 36 inches of protective soil, and then we'll vegetate and seed it. Construction work necessary to install a closure cap. Again, the most critical part of this, and all of these documents, this is all the construction quality assurance, quality control plans. These are all part of the plans that have been submitted. So we developed this. This is implemented for all phases of construction. We've got to have independent engineering certification of all the construction work that's done for the closure cap. There's obviously a series of permits that are going to be necessary for sediment and erosion control. Those will be in place. Soil materials, one of the aspects that we're looking at very carefully. We're eliminating as much as possible the best we can do to get any truck traffic off the roads. We're looking at on-site borrow areas for the cover materials to eliminate truck traffic on the highways, truck traffic through the city. And then, in addition, there'll be dust suppression plans for all the phases of construction.
Everyone will have the opportunity to ask questions, and not just about the closure plan, but about everything. So if we could just let these guys finish. IDEM will weigh in on what they've heard from the closure plan. We're going to have Lawrenceburg Municipal Utilities also weigh in, and then everyone will be given an opportunity to ask every question that they have, certainly, just so we can pick it up on the microphone. Thank you.
Sure. And just to reiterate again the extent of the closure cap. Another component, this again are part of the plans that we've submitted, which are the post-closure obligations for the closed fly ash pond, and these obviously I think are a critical component. We have inspection and maintenance activities, semi-annual inspections and monitoring of the cap, looking for gullies, any type of erosion. We've got a maintenance obligation to mow, repair, removal of any type of sediment or any type of issues that we see associated with the soil cover. And then there's a groundwater monitoring program that's going to be put in place post-closure, which is going to include semi-annual sample analysis of approximately 20 wells. That number probably, that's a good number to talk with, but completely surrounding the fly ash pond. These wells are either existing or the majority of these are going to be installed. And the analytical parameter list is really what's required by the
Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and the parameter list is derived specifically for the material that's stored there, which is fly ash. So you'll be looking predominantly at metals. And then there's an obligation to submit semi-annual reports, and those reports will include a statistical evaluation of the groundwater quality, of whether or not there's been any degradation, if you will, of the groundwater quality. No, I don't.
With the slides up there, and as the presentation's being.
I'd prefer if he's got a question now, just let him.
I won't be able to see the slides, and I won't be able to have a good understanding of what's going on when he asks his question.
I would agree.
You all
Prefer to have the information out there while you're quoting it.
You can ask questions at the podium then.
I think the question that you had is who's going to be taking the groundwater, who's going to be doing the groundwater sampling. That the groundwater sampling's done typically by a consulting firm, by a certified consulting firm, a geologist, hydrogeologist. There's a specific process that's necessary in terms of the sampling procedures that has to be followed, and the laboratory work itself is done by a certified lab. All by Tanner Creek Development, LLC.
I'd also like to point out that it's your employees that take the samples and have historically taken the samples since it was transferred from AEP, so that's not true. Can't hear a word you say. Can you get a mic there? How about having you come up to the mic? Yeah, sure. I can come back and say it. Yeah, you stated that it's a third party that takes.
I didn't say it.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll leave that up to the cameras. But it has historically been your employees since AEP has transferred the property, and before that it was AEP employees.
Sure, EAG is an in-house consultant. And
But isn't that actually your company? Isn't that the same people?
Yes, we have certified hydrogeologists. We've got the professional people that know how to take groundwater samples. That is correct.
No further questions with that one.
I would like to address that further. I work for EAG as part of the engineering group.
And also Tanner's Creek Development LLC, and also CDCCO, and also et al.
I work for many companies as a consulting engineer, as every consulting engineer does. We do take samples at Tanner's Creek landfill from the wells. We take samples at other sites around the country and in Canada from various groundwater monitoring wells and things of that nature. And on this particular site, if you've been analyzing the history of what the data that's been collected at the wells, it's shown that there hasn't been any statistical variance. If you're implying that the samples were tampered with before they were set in an independent lab, it would show statistical variance. It doesn't show that. As with all of our sampling, it's always done with integrity, and we do not sample we pull samples and send them to a lab. We don't actually run the lab analysis ourselves. That's always done by an independent lab. And again, there's been no change in those results. So for anybody to question the integrity of that, or if there's any foul play, that has not been shown to date on any of our sites.
No, I wasn't claiming that you were falsifying the water testing. I was pointing out that it was misleading to state that it's a separate company that's doing it when it's just the same people wearing a different hat. And there's really no opportunity for there to be any statistical variance in the testing because the monitoring wells are all jammed up against the property, against that landfill, instead of the recommended distance, because the landfill itself is up against the river and Tanner's Creek. So there's no opportunity for those tests to look any different. And the variance, the simple tests themselves have such variance that it would be impossible to tell any difference.
You want to introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm sorry, I was brought up that I should introduce myself. I'm Adam Peets. I'm an engineer that works for Environetics Group. And the wells that are installed were not installed by us, they were installed by AEP. So again, we didn't deliberate anything
and they were then installed under the approval of IDEM. So again, there was no collusion anywhere. I do not appreciate the inference that there is lack of integrity with the company I work for or the companies that I consult for, which are technically separate companies, although we do work for a lot of them as their exclusive consultant.
No. Yes, AEP did put those wells in, and when they did, IDEM did acknowledge that limitation that the wells were too close to ever see any significant difference, but that was as good as they could get. And the question I think that's most important isn't about whether there's a difference up gradient and down gradient, it's the levels that are being shown in the wells themselves. Those may not be a violation themselves because there is no difference that can be reasonably construed. If those were to appear at the Aurora wellhead, that would be a violation. That well would no longer be drinkable. That's the concern that I think everybody needs to understand.
There are other monitoring wells in place that monitor closer to those wellheads, and there's not been a violation shown there. The wells that are placed around the landfill are to monitor the landfill, not to monitor the Aurora wellhead.
Right, but we enjoy the benefit of that early warning system. The monitoring wells that are next to our water supply
The
are
early
about 30
warning
yards
system
away.
you're discussing has not shown a violation. I think that's what everybody needs to know.
Yeah.
And I would like to move on to something a little more important.
Okay, yeah, we're going to move on to something more important than our water. Thank you.
The important thing here is there's not been a violation. As we both agreed upon, there has not been a violation. The wells are monitored continuously. They're monitored by the new owner. They've been monitored by the old owner, AEP. There's never been a cause for concern shown in these wells. These wells are also common to every landfill installation, almost every landfill installation. They're again, ordinary practices for environmental remediation projects and for capping ash ponds and landfills. The fact that there has been no violation shown should be reassuring. It should not cause you to be concerned about your groundwater. It should show you that it is being protected. It's a good thing.
I just want to say that this whole process is new to me. I wasn't aware that you got your own water samples and then sent them off to an independent company to test that water. So there's no regulation or oversight as far as getting those samples, correct?
No.
Let me try to, and
Russ, just so everyone's aware, there are over 8,000 power plants currently in the U.S. There are over 2,500 utilities. Every single one of those power plants and utilities does self-testing and self-reporting per FERC and NERC. So it is a well-established, very well-accepted policy or procedure that we do, that entities do. It's not uncommon, it's not foreign, it's what they do, and they report those things under penalty of law. So it's extremely common. It's been happening for decades in this country.
Is there a chain of command?
It seems to be an important point, so I'll just go into a little bit about the groundwater sampling process, and we have Indiana Department of Environmental Management can talk about it afterwards. The sampling protocols for groundwater are very rigid in terms of the process that you have to follow and to be able to take an accurate groundwater sample. The records that you have to keep when you do the sampling is all part of the information that gets submitted to the state. They'll review that information. So the process itself to take a groundwater sample is a very established protocol that has to be followed. So the person taking the sample from this semi-annual to the next semi-annual always has to follow that same process. There's an amount of time and a series of parameters that you have to monitor for that have to stabilize to ensure that you're taking actual groundwater from the ground. All of those records are included in these semi-annual reports. Once that sample is taken, there's a chain of custody process that's followed, in which that person takes it to an independent laboratory, and there's a signatory process involved in terms of handoff, so that everybody in the chain of custody has to sign off on that groundwater sample. So the process itself is very rigid in terms of what's necessary to take a groundwater sample. Because that process is so rigid, that allows, I mean, all owners take their own, for the most part, take their own groundwater samples. All of that documentation is provided to the state. Some owners even run their own analyses. We do not. We use an independent laboratory. There really is the issue of whether or not, but that's the process that's followed to take a groundwater sample.
And Russ, not to interrupt, but if it's okay with you, if we could handle the public comments and questions at the conclusion of the program. We only have the room until 8:30, and I want to honor the groups that are here so they can all weigh in. We'll make sure everyone's questions are asked and answered, certainly.
I have a question pertaining to what he was just talking about prior to the left turn, if I could interject. Very quick, brief. I'm sorry, you were talking about, my name is Brian DeBriller. You were talking about dust suppression with regard to, I believe, some of the closure obligations. Back on April 12th, we had an incident where basically the whole city was consumed in a dust cloud of fugitive, I assume, fly ash from the pond behind Pizza Hut. Now, I called IDEM, and I spoke to Amanda Dant. Is that correct? Or Vant? I'm not sure. She's in air quality. I should have her name correct. I spoke to her about that, and another gentleman there, she had advised me to call the emergency response number after I initially called, but I think that's something we were all aware of. Do you have any explanation as to what occurred that day or why we experienced that? Because that wasn't the first time. That was probably the most severe incident that we had of fugitive dust in the city, and I'm assuming that that's probably not good for people to breathe. I didn't analyze the dust or anything, but considering its source, I think that the city was kind of concerned about that, so I didn't know.
Yes, we had an incident on April 12th.
Any explanation as to what caused it? I mean, what?
The explanation of what caused it was that we had a water truck that broke down.
Okay.
And by the time and that incident happened, and it was just, that's the explanation that we had, is our dust measures that we had for our water truck. Our water truck broke down, and there was a time period before we got it fixed.
I know you weren't personally responsible for it.
Well,
I'm not pointing my finger at you, but I spoke to the mayor about that, and he and I conversed, and I think you even shot some video footage of it on a prior occurrence. But that was just something that concerned me, with it being airborne. I don't know if you saw any of those pictures, but it was the equivalent of, it looked like a picture from the Dust Bowl. I mean, you couldn't even see the Seagram's buildings. There was so much dust, so just wanted to throw that in there because you were talking about
I do understand, and since that time, there is a dust suppression plan that's been developed, and we are implementing it, and understand.
Okay, thank you.
Security is one other obligation that we have, and then again, the post-closure care is required for 30 years unless modified by the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. I think that's an obligation that everybody needs to understand. Once this is closed, we do not walk away. There's an obligation to continue to monitor groundwater, continue to monitor and maintain that cap for 30 years. Just wanted to briefly touch on this is the regulatory approval and the public involvement. This meeting tonight really is a public information meeting. We are doing this with guidance from the Indiana Department of Environmental Management because of the interest in this closure plan. The design documents themselves we will make available either in the library or they will become available on the Indiana Department of Environmental Management website. And what this really does is this is a preliminary, this is more of a public information meeting, and that there will be a formal public comment process that will follow this. That public comment process will have a duration of 30 days. So we are not short-circuiting this. This is just, if you will, it's a voluntary public information meeting for you to try to answer some of the questions. And this is occurring prior to the public comment process. And I think Dell would like to jump in here and then just defer this, I think, to later.
Yes, please. Thank you, Rob.
So thank you, Russ. We certainly appreciate it, and we appreciate the public questions and comments. Obviously, these are exactly the reasons why we've kind of gathered these people in the room today. Now, you've heard from ELT, CDC, Tanner's Creek, and they've kind of explained to you what's going on with the closure plan. However, tonight is about everything, not just the closure plan. And so with that in mind, I next want to introduce and again thank the members of IDEM who have driven here, a much larger and robust group than even we could have hoped for when we started calling around frantically, just seeing who the best people we could get here would be. Rebecca Yanoshkin is kind of leading this group. So Becky, thank you for being here. If you could just kind of introduce yourself and your group. And I think what we're most interested in hearing about tonight, and I won't speak for everyone, is if you could touch on some of the issues that were brought up during the ELT presentation. But more generally than that, we need to know, is our water safe? How is it made safe? And how is that process continuing so that we can rest assured that activity like plant cleanup does not jeopardize our water supply? So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I can hear myself. Oh, there we go. Thank you all. First, thank you all for coming tonight and for your interest in this project. We appreciate you taking your evening out to learn, and we definitely welcome your participation and comments and input in this process. We've been working with Tanner's Creek since they took over ownership of this property, and through a number of different things. So what Russ has just finished talking about is a closure plan relating to the fly ash pond. So I think I'll start there. That pond, we've received closure plans. We've had a number of back and forths there, but we're getting fairly close to being able to approve that, and to get them to they'll then follow the closure plan. And that, I guess, let me explain that the closure plan kind of steps through what they're going to do to really to cap that and be done with that. Once those activities are complete, the fugitive dust problem should completely go away. Right now we've got kind of waste exposed there, and there we went out to the facility today to look around, and they do have the water truck out there and operating constantly to keep that under control. So we did receive your reports, and we'll definitely try to keep moving on the approval of the closure plan, because that completing those activities will eliminate that issue. Let's see. So the fly ash pond, as they were saying, has a liner underneath it, which for the time period in which it was constructed is somewhat unusual and a positive, very positive thing. Through the closure plan review process, we've been looking at the proximity of the drinking water supply wells, and I know that's and it's reasonable, very reasonable, and to ask questions and be concerned about that, and we're concerned about that as well. And so part of the closure plan review and approval process will include the addition of monitoring wells and making sure we really have a good understanding of if there are releases currently, what those are, and how to set up a system that anticipates and gives us that early warning system. So that is contained within the closure plan, and we're working on getting that well network set up. What else do we need to talk about?
And Becky, if I may, I don't want to just ask you really random questions. I think specifically I can help guide this a little bit. So when we talk about monitoring wells, what's a monitoring well, and why is that important?
So yeah, I guess to distinguish that we have two different kinds of wells that we're talking about. Monitoring wells are specifically installed around land disposal units like this. So we have the fly ash pond, we have a restricted waste site landfill, and we've got the main ash pond. All three of those disposal units will have monitoring wells surrounding them. So they're fairly narrow wells. They're not production wells to produce drinking water. They're wells that we use to take samples a couple of times a year. We have a groundwater monitoring plan that's included in either the closure plan or the permit, depending on which unit we're talking about. That plan identifies the locations of the wells, their construction, their depth, what the parameters that we're analyzing for. There's also a plan, you guys talked about that a bit, about how you collect those samples, that chain of custody, the laboratory, kind of the content and format of the report. And those groundwater monitoring results are submitted to the agency. And John Garatas here and his staff review those reports. One of the way that program works is we kind of start with some baseline information. We get some background information and develop a statistical plan that helps us know, okay, what does the water look like? And then if there were a release, kind of how would we know? How much above that background level would you say, okay, we've got a problem, we've got a release, we need to do further investigation and potentially implement some corrective actions to limit that release and remediate that release.
So
that's monitoring well
yes,
networks. And then the other thing you're talking about is that they're drinking water supply wells. So those are what we call production wells. Those are, pulling large volumes of water. So when we go out and take a groundwater monitoring sample, we're talking a pint. We're not there. How much volume of water would you pull out of one of those? Couple gallons. So much different than a groundwater, drinking water supply well, a production well. So two very different types of wells, and definitely important that you that you understand that concept.
So in terms of this property in particular, and specifically the time period after which ELT began their remediation process, could you walk us through generally your goals, your focus, and what you've done to ensure that this cleanup is done in a safe way?
So with regards to the fly ash pond, there's no kind of remedial activity going on there. We are closing that disposal unit. The cap and cover kind of serve. Somebody talked about this before. Imagine we've got a pond there, and it's really been serving as a bathtub, and that's good. That's what it was designed to do. They've been sluicing ash there for many, many years, and it's been holding that ash in place, and then slowly that ash is dewatered, and the water is collected and sent over to the plant where it was treated. But now we don't need that. We don't need that bathtub anymore, and so they're putting a cap and cover over the top of it to reduce and essentially eliminate any infiltration from the top, so that ash will be, dewatered, and we should, basically be getting to dry ash within that landfill that should not be producing water, that could be released. And then we have that unit ringed with groundwater monitoring wells so that we can watch that. There's a liner there, but it was put in place in the 70s, and that's kind of what we do when and this isn't unique to this location. Wherever we have any sort of landfill, we are ringing it with groundwater monitoring wells, and we're watching that. We're monitoring that for any release, so that if we need to, we can go in and remediate that.
And beyond the closure plan, in terms of the demolition project and any materials that might be generated from that project, gentleman talked about the foundations or just the materials that are part of the stacks. How do we ensure that those materials aren't going to stay on the property and contaminate the soil that would then contaminate the water?
So the units, the disposal units that we are focused on as a group right now are the fly ash pond, the restricted waste site landfill, and the main ash pond. So that's what we have formal closure plans and permits around. But let me answer your question. So clean demolition debris, rocks, dust, dirt, even clean vegetation is not considered to be solid waste in the state of Indiana. So as long as those materials are clean, they can be disposed of most anywhere. So I'm not familiar with the demolition plan. We've been focused on the units that we're responsible for closing. So I'm not sure exactly where all the materials that are being generated from that demolition are going, but if they are waste, if they're classified as solid waste, they need to go to a solid waste landfill. If they're hazardous waste, they need to go to a hazardous waste facility. But if they're excluded materials like uncontaminated rocks, bricks, dirt, they can be managed on site.
And whose responsibility is it to monitor the demolition materials?
That is not items. And you may have some more information on what you're doing on that. We just don't have a lot of involvement in that area. So.
No, the demolition process by its nature generates clean debris, bricks, and concrete, which is best in the state of the industry is to try to beneficially reuse that as much as possible rather than take it to a landfill. So it's our obligation to, whether it's clean concrete and bricks, as indicated, that's not regulated material. That material can be used as backfill for basements and deep within the structures, which is commonly done. Most of the time that material will be downsized and it's placed in the structures. It is similar to you would of any other type of backfill material. It's no different of a backfill material than if we would import clean soil.
Okay.
And I will concur that is common practice. That's not unusual, that you use the materials you have on site. Hold on just a second. You will see, you see this more and more as you see different facilities coming down. People dismantle facilities now very intentionally and go to quite a bit of effort to segregate, what's metal, what's reusable brick, and to really not take anything for final disposal and have to pay for that disposal, then they have to. So that's part of kind of our shift in terms of waste management from just viewing everything as waste and focusing a little bit more on what's the resource value of some of these materials. And so I'm sure that's part of kind of demolishing these sorts of structures, but not having it just all be a disposal cost. You try to make the best use of the materials that you generate. Yes, sir.
Real quick, I can just follow that up. What is regulated during the demolition process, though, is asbestos materials, universal waste. Universal wastes are light bulbs, mercury switches, a variety of different types of what you would consider to be, you can get a lot of light bulbs, you can get a lot of just mercury switches, you can get obviously any kind of sludges and any kind of electrical equipment. That any type of, so all of that is regulated on the upfront of a demolition process. All of that is removed as part of it prior to any type of demolition activity, and there is an obligation that is gone through in which there are items inspections, routine inspections to ensure that all those types of materials are removed prior to demolition.
And so, Mr. Becker, you can assure us that we don't have to worry that there are harmful materials like asbestos that are on the property that will remain on the property, because I think that's a concern we have, that those materials may not contaminate the soil or the water now, but that they could at some point if they're left there.
Removal of asbestos is a regulated practice in which you have to use a licensed contractor to do it, with a license within the state of Indiana. There's a process where they go through notifications and through inspections. And once they're complete, depending on the type of facility, you'll have a final inspection either by state of Indiana or by that licensed contractor that all asbestos has been removed. We need to have that process complete before any demolition can occur.
And that was my next question. Thank you. When would that inspection occur?
Those inspections, when asbestos was being removed, I think were happening probably on a frequency of once per month.
Thank you, and thank you, Becky. Again, just generally understanding the kind of questions and concerns, what would you say that IDEM's focus will be moving forward as we, because this is closure plan for one pond, correct? There are so many steps that remain in regard to this property. So what's IDEM's focus moving forward?
So we'll prioritize getting the fly ash pond closure plan approved so they can start implementing that. And while we're kind of as close in the construction season here, try to get that accomplished. The next thing we have in-house already is the restricted waste site landfill permit renewal application is in-house. So we'll be reviewing that. I haven't looked at that, but I understand from our conversation that that will pretty much, I don't think there's going to be a lot involved with that review, just kind of keeping it stable and continuing care there. The third thing that's happening, is we expect, I think in early August is what we've heard most recently, closure plan to address the main ash pond. So this is the ash pond that's kind of right at the confluence of the Ohio and Tanner's Creek. And it's the main ash pond, the old ash pond? You had two other?
There's an old ash area. And it basically is going to be a closure plan for the remaining areas next to the plant of which there are ash materials present and exposed at the surface. So that entire area, in order to support redevelopment, needs to go through a closure process. The closure process and that plan is being developed now. That will go through. We'll go through the same exact process, but with IDEM and with public involvement for that part of the plan.
So we haven't seen that yet, but that that'll be kind of the third piece for us.
And I do want to circle back briefly to some of the discussion, because I think even you mentioned the age of the liner, and then there was some discussion about the size or the location of the banks, and I'll probably botch the terminology, but in terms of the liner itself, and we've talked about the importance of the integrity of these layers of soil and then the non-permeable cap, how does IDEM ensure that that is structurally sound and that is put together in a way that will protect the surrounding environment?
So I was talking earlier about the bathtub. So, we have that liner is in there, and that's the bottom of the bathtub at this point. They're dewatering those materials, and, they're getting closer and closer to those being dry. Certainly once the cap and cover are over the top, we're dealing with dry material. And so, and I know there was a question earlier about kind of groundwater or water table rising up, and would that disrupt that liner? And I don't think the groundwater table is anywhere close to the bottom of that liner, so don't expect any uplift or issue there. So it is an older liner. Certainly in most situations, we would not have this volume of waste exhumed so we could put down a new liner. So we're going to work with what we have there. But once we have that ash dried out inside, we have the cap and the cover over the top and the liners underneath, there really isn't, we don't have groundwater percolating in from the side. What they were describing earlier was, that cap and cover would go beyond the liner and kind of tie into that. So really making a nice little pouch pocket there, that there really should not be water releases of water from that unit. So
I would like to add to that real quick.
Absolutely.
Well, and just briefly, so my follow-up to that would be, regardless of the age of the liner or the type of the pond, because all these ponds are very different and the closure plan will look different, but the end result is that highest level of scrutiny. We won't cut corners in terms of the end result and the protection of the water. Is that fair to say?
Right. We're charged as an agency to protect human health and the environment, and we take that very seriously. We have staff that have spent their entire professional careers focused on these sorts of issues, and we are overseeing the closure plan here in the same way we would do it across the state, to the same what we think are high standards and according to the rules and regulations that we have. So.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I apologize.
That's fine. To add to the concerns over the degradation of the cap and of the liner, these liner materials are types of plastic that are very similar to actually the trash bags that you use at home, but they're much thicker. Same material, but much thicker. And once this material is basically taken out of oxidation and UV radiation, meaning it's not exposed to the surface, sunlight, and weathering, it will last thousands of years. During construction, you usually have concerns about puncture, but they put in a soft layer when they install the bottom liner to account for that. And then when you're doing final construction, you're very careful with the layer right underneath the liner. And then on top of that, you have your grid, which again protects it, so puncture isn't concerned. So this material will last for thousands of years in the condition in which it's installed. And then to go beyond that, with regards to your concerns about groundwater monitoring and dust suppression and everything else, when these capping systems are put in place, it is important to know for everybody in the area that there will be more monitoring wells and more testing and more eyes on construction than there has ever been during the filling of these areas. Okay, so these areas will be more monitored more closely and they'll be more scrutinized throughout closure. Once these plans are constructed, than there is beforehand, while the entire time AEP had this property. We go in there and we clean it up and we try to take things that are exposed and either remove them or cap them, consolidate them, protect the environment and the people. And in order to do that, we need to move forward with these plans.
And you said, sir, that you, upon completion, you will have an ongoing 30-year obligation to guarantee the quality of these closure plans. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. That can be adjusted by the state as needed, as it would be on another landfill of something nature. Sometimes it's extended, depending upon if there is concerns, as Becky alluded to, if there is a well that detects something maybe, then you go in immediately, and sometimes your closure plan can start all over depending upon what is detected. Most cases, nothing's ever detected and things close normally and everything's fine. But if something should happen, that 30-year period doesn't get us off the hook. It means we still have to go in there and maybe do more than that.
And to that end, AEP have an ongoing obligation.
That is what we're here to address. That is what our company does. We address the concerns and obligations, environmental obligations of companies like AEP and many other very large companies that have manufacturing facilities, power plants, former landfills, oil refineries, many other types of environmentally contaminated sites. We clean them up.
In that,
Sorry,
that was.
A public hearing. Can we go off your script and let people ask their own questions?
Yeah, we'll have public comments and questions at the conclusion. And we've got
15 minutes. We got 15 minutes, and you're going to talk during all of it.
We have extra time. It'll be okay. We'll get to everyone's questions. So to that end, that was something that was interesting for me to learn, is that it isn't just ELT, CDC, AEP has an ongoing obligation that they are fulfilling through you, but they also have persons that are monitoring the site and monitoring the
cleanup. And AEP monitors the work, continues to monitor the work we are doing. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And just, first of all, again, your questions will be asked. You'll have the opportunity to ask them yourselves, but the questions that I'm asking are based on what I've been hearing from the public, so I just want to make sure everyone's voice is heard today. Thank you, ELT, thank you to IDEM. I do want to allow our utility director, Olin Clausen, to speak briefly, if he'll humor me, because after hearing what ELT's presented, after hearing what IDEM's presented, I think Olin can weigh in on his perspective as our local spearhead for monitoring this property independently, and just what his findings are and how they align with what we've heard today. So I appreciate it.
Dale, maybe real quick, I think
yeah, we'll get to you, Brian. Well, we'll get to you. Okay, thank you. I appreciate everybody being patient.
So I think what's important to understand from the utilities perspective is that myself and my staff, no one's more concerned about the quality of the water that we're sending to our residents than we are. There's testing that's required by the state. It's kind of on a rotation, but it basically boils down to a 3-year testing period. We have on a regular basis taken it upon ourselves to test the wells, not just Lawrenceburg's wells, but also LMS and Aurora's wells, on a more regular basis to ascertain for ourselves what the quality of the water actually We've also compared some of that data to the data that's on hand, some of that you referenced, to look for indications that there might be an uptick in things that are harmful to our residents. Based on those test results, we haven't seen any indication that there's any evidence of an upward trending problem in any of the drinking wells. Boron gets brought up quite a bit, and there's been one well that's tested higher than the others. The World Health Organization, I believe, lists boron as a problem at 10,000? Roughly 10,000 parts per billion. And that well is currently testing at 1,000 parts per billion. So it's 9,000 times underneath the level upon which the World Health Organization considers that to be a problem. And also, you know, we as a utility, just like any utility, we have a set of ground rules that we have to play by. There's things that we have to report on. There's things that we have to make sure that we're watching, that we're dealing with. And it's not up to us as a local entity to go out and get ahead of the state or the federal government on dictating whether or not boron should be a regulated item. If it were, and if there was a requirement that it was to be under a certain limit, then obviously we would do what we had to do to ensure that were the case. But as it stands today, it's not identified by the state of Indiana. And so therefore, we haven't been compelled to look into that. Doesn't mean that we're not concerned about it, doesn't mean that we're not looking at it. It's just something that we don't have any opinion on, really. We're well aware of what the levels are according to other organizations, and we're well below those. And so, as a utility director, when I have elderly customers calling me, telling me that they're afraid to take baths because of the things they're reading on Facebook, and that them and the other people in their apartment complex are going out and buying bottled water because of the things they're reading on Facebook, that's concerning to me. That is a form of fear-mongering that I don't appreciate, and that I don't think is helpful to this process whatsoever. And so myself and my staff have gone to great lengths to try to calm some of those fears, to provide factual data to our customers, to the residents of Dearborn County, the city, Aurora, LMS. And it's sometimes frustrating when our efforts to provide that factual data are subverted, or they're deleted from certain public posts. And so I guess in closing, from the utilities perspective, again, nobody's more concerned than we are. We have been very proactive on our testing and providing that information to our elected officials so they can provide that to their constituents, and we will continue to do that. And nobody is going to scream louder or longer than Lawrenceburg Municipal Utilities if in fact we find a problem that warrants that.
Yeah. I think this.
I have a few questions. Sorry. I've been waiting.
No. Yeah,
Okay.
And I'll just be quick. I was just going to kind of resonate the comments from your local utility. Yeah, we also take drinking water quality very seriously, and one of our prime jobs is to oversee that information that's sent in from our local utilities. And we kind of follow the Safe Drinking Water Act, which you all do too, and it has a myriad of different parameters that are regulated by the federal government. And I don't know if that's me or okay. I'm getting feedback. So, so anyway, your utilities are doing a great job. That can be reflected and reviewed through their consumer confidence reports that they submit to us every year. It's available. I don't know how each of you receive them, but they can be either online or come through your billing. But it's basically an overview of the results of what they've found in their water through the year and the activities that they do to promote safe drinking water. And I was very encouraged to hear that they are sampling their, is it the raw water that you're all sampling? Yeah, which is a real good indication of what they are seeing at the source. Not only are they meeting the requirements of the distribution, which is the treated water, but they're also going above and beyond looking at that water that is at their well, which is not required. So kudos. And if you'd like to share that information with us, that would be one more thing that we could use and kind of watching what things are going on here. So I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Olin. And I do want to turn this over to questions and comments. Again, this town hall, this forum is for you guys. So I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak. We have asked for additional time from Ivy Tech. So I'm going to bring the microphone around. Just say your name for the record, maybe where you're from, and then state your question. And then we'll let whoever is most appropriate answer it. Absolutely.
I have a couple more questions. Could you guys, with all due respect, you're all from IDEM. Could you all introduce yourself and please tell me what you do for IDEM?
Yeah, sorry.
Please?
Kind of were asked to do that earlier and just kind of moved right through it. My name is Becky Yonishkan, and I'm the branch chief for the permits branch within the Office of Land Quality. And so in that branch, we have staff that manage solid waste permits, that's John Hale here to my left, and Amy McClure is over there. She's John's section chief. Okay. So that's the person that, like you'll see on the fact sheet that we've handed out, you'll on the bottom, on the back, we talk about a comment period. So John Hale's the person who's managing this, the closure plan process for us, and the permit, and the other.
I've spoke to John on the phone a few times. So.
Great, so that's John.
Nice
and
to
then
meet you, sir.
Within the branch, we have a group of engineers and a group of geologists that provide technical review of these applications. So they're also an integral. We don't have and so John Garataz is here this evening, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. So John Garataz is our section chief for geology. So his geologists have been busy looking at the situation here. I'll let you
sure.
talk.
I didn't know if you were done. Again, my name is John Garataz, and I am the section chief of the geology section in the Office of Land Quality. I have a team of geologists. There's about, I think there's 11 of us that go over reports that Russ was talking about, and we look at them very diligently. We review all the data. We review the statistics. We review the laboratory reports. And so when they're submitted to us, we basically give our okay, or we say, sorry, but this report, the testing was done correctly, so you would have to go out and retest again. So there was concern earlier about a company doing their own testing. These reports are submitted to us, and we look at them, and we look at municipal solid waste landfill reports. We look at non-municipal. We look at restricted waste sites, such as restricted waste site 1 out here at Tanner's Creek. We look at, we even look at compost areas. So anyway, the point is that these reports are looked at by geologists very diligently, and if there are problems, we do get with the facility and we tell them the problems, and if the testing needs to be redone, the testing will be redone. So it's just not put into a black box. And if you go on to VFC and look at some of the geology, we usually send the facility a letter, or we may send an email stating what we find in their reports. So I just want to make that clear, that it isn't put into a black box at IDEM and in the reports, and that's where they sit. They are reviewed in a very diligent manner with a team of about 11, 12 geologists.
Sure. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in that filing cabinet digging around looking at stuff. I have just a general statement that I want to make with regard to this meeting. I think the majority of the residents here came to address some of concerns with the site in general. It really didn't pertain to the fly ash pond closure. We just became aware, and I speak for myself and a few of my friends, I don't know about anybody else in the room, but we just became aware of that this meeting was to address the fly ash pond closure public comment hearing. That was kind of news to us. We've only known about that for about 5 days. I know typically with that there's a 10-day public notice period with that. We've seen a lot of information on social media, people asking questions about that. Could you guys address that or kind of explain that to us, please?
So in our rules and regulations, we do not have a specific public participation process for closure plans. So a few years ago, as we started working through, there's a new federal regulation concerning coal combustion residuals. This particular facility is not subject to that federal regulation.
The 2015 EPA updates. Correct.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. Those do require that all the pond areas be lined. Is that correct?
No.
No?
Well, if you were building a new surface impoundment today, yes, you would need a liner.
Okay.
So there's a federal regulation that's gone into effect for coal combustion residuals.
Correct.
These surface impoundments and restricted waste site landfill are not subject to those federal regulations. Okay. So, but we have a large. We have a lot of power plants in Indiana. We have a lot of coal, and we have about 84 surface impoundments across the state at maybe 14, 15 different power plants.
Right.
And some of those are subject to the federal regulation, and some of them are subject to closure under our state rules. And so we worked with Hoosier Environmental Council and the Sierra Club and a number of groups like that who wanted to make sure that there was a public participation opportunity for these closure plans. So even though it's not required by our statute or our rules, and again, this particular Tanner's Creek is not subject to the federal regulation, we developed a process to have meetings like this and provide opportunity for the public to understand what's going on and to make sure that they could comment on the plans. So
to cut it short, you're saying there's not a 10-day notification.
I developed a guidance document, and that's on our website, and we worked on that internally, and it's kind of, we keep trying
329-12-10-1?
No.
Maybe I don't have that right.
Yeah, well, 329 IEC. No, anyway, we are following a guidance document and a process that we developed kind of in cooperation with the environmental advocacy groups and the regulated utilities to give you opportunities. So it's not a perfect process. It's in general led by the applicant themselves rather than required by us. There are some recommended activities. We don't absolutely have to have a meeting, so it's fairly flexible to try to be able to react to the community needs. I regret that maybe there was short notice.
I just feel like people weren't given ample time to have to. Myself, I can only speak for myself. I was so focused on some of the other things we were talking about in the community and some of the issues that I really didn't have time myself personally to research the fly ash pond closure plan. So it was kind of last minute for me. But
I mean, the comment period that we've now opened is open through July 10th.
I understand that.
And I appreciate your feedback there, and I'll go back and look at the guidance document again and see if there's something that we need to change to make sure that we have maybe a little bit more advance warning before these sorts of meetings.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying it because I know people came here with questions that really pertain more to other things more so than the fly ash pond closure. But real quick, I don't want to take up any more time because I know there's other people that have questions. We talked about the, I'm going to refer to it as the Dust Bowl incident on April the 12th. I know I called in and reported that, and the gentleman here pretty, clearly acknowledged that it was a problem that occurred. Was there a violation issued for that? Because I'm not seeing it in the VFC, and I was curious why there wasn't.
So a release of fugitive dust is within our Office of Air Quality.
Right. It was Amanda Dant that I spoke to. I just referred to my email.
And I do not know whether or not a formal violation was pursued there. Do you know, Del?
I do actually, and Brian and some other concerned citizens did a wonderful job in rallying that morning. It wasn't the first time we've had a fugitive dust problem.
Fly ash pond. Okay, and that was the one that was shown in orange on the drawing. That pond is the one that we're capping. Now there are other ponds that contain.
And how many?
There is another pond that is about the same size as called the main ash pond. Now that one, again, we're working on plans to cap that one in the upcoming year. That one will be addressed. Then there is what we call the old ash pond, which is adjoining it. That'll be capped at the same time. There is a type 1 restricted waste landfill, which contains ash and other CCR wastes. That's not technically a pond, but it's an ash impoundment of sorts. That is currently covered with intermediate cover or soil. It's under permit, and that will need to be closed out as well. And there's another area that contains what is often referred to as bottom ash or boiler slag, which was actually, when they were producing it, it was put into large bags and was sent off-site for sale as blasting media. So there are several areas that contain ash, but as far as the fly ash pond, that exact name is only given to one pond.
I see. And the other ponds on the property, do they, you spoke that they're going to be capped. Are they, is there a concrete liner underneath those?
Concrete is never used as a liner for ash impoundments. For one,
I'm
it is
sorry,
inflexible.
what is the liner on the main pond that you've been talking about?
The main ash pond was constructed with clay.
With clay?
Yes, which at the time was very common practice. It was very common practice up until the last few decades.
I see. Are any of these other ponds on the property lined with anything?
Well, the clay was brought in and compacted as a liner. That was placed as a liner. It's not a synthetic liner, but it's a liner nonetheless.
On all the ponds?
Now, on the other ponds.
Pardon me. On all the ponds? On all the containment areas?
On the ponds, the clay was, at least clay was placed, yes. Now, the newer ones had the synthetic liner as well.
I see.
See, I like you guys. You ask direct questions. You want a direct answer. You'd be a good lawyer. So you were looking for three. There are three. It's my understanding there are three wet ponds and one dry landfill, most generally speaking. And obviously, it's more
the old ash area is a smaller pond that is sometimes lumped into the main ash pond because it's adjacent to it and will be capped with it. But it's technically a separate pond. It's a smaller pond. That would be the third one.
And there's no chance of rising groundwater could release contaminants in those other.
Well, theoretically, there is always a chance per se, but that is why we do groundwater monitoring, so that if there is a release, it's caught. Now, most of the time, a release is not caught because it doesn't occur, but theoretically, nothing's perfect, and there's always a potential for, a very small potential, but a potential for a leak, and that is why we also put in systems of groundwater monitoring wells, which were spoken about by IDEM, and that monitoring process continues on long after the actual cap is put into place. And that is why when these caps are put into place, there will actually be more protection in place than there ever has been while these ash ponds had ash put into them.
Yeah, so you said that there's a clay liner underneath it, but the engineering documents actually show that's a silty clay with sand and not pure clay. So I don't think the word liner is really appropriate to use there. And the TRC soil studies from 2014 actually show that over in the old ash area, that used to be part of Tanner's Creek, so there is no soil beneath that whatsoever, and that it is basically ash all the way down. And I have those documents here if you haven't reflected on those. But I just wanted to point out that was not an entirely accurate statement. I wanted to revisit the water quality issue about the monitoring wells, because it was pointed out that the monitoring wells are there to monitor for the release of, just basically to monitor from release from the landfill, and not actual contaminants. And I wondered why there was a distinction being made between whether they were coming from the landfill or whether the contaminants were there at all. And I think that's a very important, an important issue because it's a distinction without a difference.
You might need to rephrase the question, but I think what the process is in any land disposal unit, there's an obligation to monitor groundwater that could be impacted from it. And that's what the intended process is to do. I'm not sure how to further answer your question.
I'll ask it a better way. And sorry, Dell just asked me to introduce myself. I'm Matt Miles. And so let me see if I can ask this a better way. Basically, if there are contaminants shown in the monitoring wells that would essentially prevent the drinking water from being drinkable, why is that distinguished from whether they came from the landfill or whether they're there on all the monitoring wells? So if we see them both up gradient and down gradient, that's technically not a violation, when the fact is they're there regardless of how they got there. So I think, as I said before, that was a distinction without a difference. The contaminants are there regardless of whether they came from the landfill or not. The fact is they do exist. They are not a myth or an imagination. They're documented in public records, and they're half a mile from the wellhead, and the water flow documents prove that the water is flowing from that direction toward the wellhead. And I have all that here if you want to review that.
And could we have ELT and IDEM maybe both address that, and even Olin if you have any input?
If I understand your question right, you're asking what we're concerned about at IDEM. We're concerned, okay, is the unit, the landfill itself, leaking? Okay, if the background quality that is not affected by the landfill is showing high levels of something, that's a concern general for the drinking water. But for that landfill, which we are regulating, we, in my section, we say, okay, well, the landfill is not causing that problem, okay? And the drinking water, maybe there has to be a further concern of the water coming from somewhere else, and that has to be addressed, and maybe found out where that water is coming from. But looking at the landfill itself, we're saying the landfill is not affecting the groundwater. So in that respect, we're done within our program area. Now we can ask the questions and try to help figure out where the high levels are coming from somewhere else. But for that landfill itself, we're saying the landfill itself is not causing the problem. So within the confines of our regulation, we're not able to do any more. And we'll move to a different authority to figure out what's going on, and Jim may come into play on that. If we know of a source somewhere else, upgrading of the landfill, just in general, any landfill, we may investigate that within IDEM, but within the confines of our program area, we're looking at saying, okay, is this landfill causing the problem?
Yeah, I think we've established that. The issue is that for the past 2 months, we've been alerting local officials and you as well that these do exist. And in fact, we just had Olin Clausen get up and basically call me a fearmonger for saying that. So as you're saying, it's not your responsibility. Local officials are saying it's not their responsibility. Everyone's saying it's not their responsibility. And they're actually accusing me of making it up. So I would like to find out whose responsibility is it? I would like you all to decide that amongst yourselves. Thank you.
And that's a fair question. So if maybe ELT, IDEM, and Olin and Andy could kind of walk through just generally how because I understand that everyone's focused on maybe specific areas, but as a community, we're focused on the entire property. So how do we ensure that the entire property is safe as it relates to our water?
I'm not, on the water quality around the whole area, for this area, I'm not totally familiar with if the levels that we're seeing are levels that are of concern. It sounds like from the utility company, that they're testing the levels and they haven't seen the levels that are above any kind of concern. So I'm not quite sure where to go with that.
Can you tell, like, what is the source of your data? You know, we have groundwater monitoring results that we're looking at, and the drinking water branch
I'm happy to
in
clarify
IDEM
that.
has data, and so help us understand what numbers you're
Can I
seeing
bring
and where
you-
they're coming from.
Can I bring you some pictures?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Okay, so these are from the monitoring wells that are down at the landfill. And so right here, this is the landfill. This is the fly ash pond. Here's the Aurora wells and the LMS wells. And you can see these arrows show the flow of water. And this is one of several graphs from that document that show the historical levels going back to when the landfill was open. And this is not the best graph. It's a print off. But the levels show, you know, upwards of 10 ppm of most heavy metals and about 300 ppm to 500 ppm of arsenic. There are some levels in there that are really a very big concern, and you can see that the way the water flows is from this landfill to the wellhead. And it's whether or not it's coming from that landfill, the fact is that it's showing up, and it's about 1,900 feet away, and the only thing between those contaminants in the wellhead is this fly ash pond, which is why my original suggestion was to do some ground testing between here and there and figure out how close they actually were. And so I guess that to go back to my original question is, whose responsibility is it to deal with this?
When you say how close they actually were, what, I didn't understand that.
So this is testing done in the monitoring wells. The wells are stationary, but the water is flowing. So, and we see the levels changing. So these contaminants are on the move. And we know from here to here, that's a 5-year travel time, about that far. And this is about half as close as that, but there is a fly ash pond in the way with clay that can slow things down and some liners. So what we don't know as a community is whether these contaminants are going around, under, through, or what. So these contaminants are dangerously close to the wellhead, and I've been attempting repeatedly to get someone to take me seriously on this, and everyone keeps telling me that it's not their responsibility. I was more than happy to accept that responsibility.
So we do know that the groundwater level is below the fly ash pond. So the fly ash pond is incised into the ground, it's cut into the ground, and we know that the actual groundwater is below that waste. So when we've got water flowing from underneath the restricted waste site landfill or even beyond, and then under the fly ash pond, it is going under the fly ash pond. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Matt, looking at your drawing and looking at the constituent list you've got on this graph, the levels I'm seeing on the graph, if I understand the graph correctly, they're not actionable levels to say we've got a major problem, okay? I mean, they're being detected. Some of these constituents are being detected, but also understand that these levels aren't at that level that we say we have to clean up the groundwater, okay? Now that I have an understanding of what your diagram is showing, okay, when the groundwater monitoring system goes into place at the fly ash pond, okay, and it's going to be a system that we're going to evaluate, and we're going to, looking at the closure plan, they're probably going to have to put in more wells, okay? When that happens, they get the wells, they get the testing. If they have problems with those wells from that diagram, from the diagram you're showing me, if they have problems, it will be our responsibility to deal with that issue, okay? Right now, we do not have as many wells as we need around the fly ash pond. It's just the way that the situation's worked over the 40 years, however long this ash pond's been here. Now we're getting this ash pond up to speed with the monitoring, okay? And we put the wells in, we find out there's a problem, we deal with it, okay? So if you're asking who's going to deal with it, we will deal with that. If there are actionable levels where we feel like through the statistics and the federal drinking water standards, if there's a problem, we will deal with that problem and we'll come up with a solution to fix it. Right now, with your utilities, They don't see a problem at the wells that they're testing, from what they've said, okay? So, but we will be dealing with it based on your pictures once we get the monitoring system in. Does that help?
Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
I can't respond to those concerns and point out that there is no, that the utilities responsible for those wells are not here to speaking today. I don't see Randy Turner anywhere.
Yeah. I don't know.
I'll do that. Well, so those levels are above the drinking water standards, especially 10 ppm of vanadium and lead. And I don't see how you're going to address those concerns when Aurora does not have a treatment facility and cannot put one there. Thank you.
One thing I'd like for everybody here to understand, I know there's been a lot of discussion about contaminants and monitoring wells and results and everything else. Your drinking water providers have people here tonight, and from what they've indicated, there is no hits, no concern, nothing in exceedance in the water that you are currently receiving at your tap. Okay, there's discussion about some monitoring wells that are unrelated to that. And I know a lot of people, as was referred to, the elderly and whatnot, are calling up and things like that. I just want everybody in this room to tell their friends and everybody else in town to understand that their water is perfectly safe to drink. And that these impoundments have been in place for a long time. There hasn't been any change, and that there has been no effect to the drinking water. It's still clean to drink. And that when these capping systems and these monitoring systems are in place, there will be further protections to continue to ensure that your drinking water is still clean to drink.
I have a question. My name's Chris Muller, and I drink the water down here, and I like it. But I actually, my concern is not so much with what people think is happening right now. My concern is, what do you do if you find a problem in one of these monitoring wells? What is the solution to that? Because with our water is coming from underground aquifers, if you contaminate the underground aquifer with arsenic, for example, I don't know how you get that out of the aquifer. I think when I talked to one of your geologists up there, they told me that what ends up happening is that you have to then treat it at the water treatment plant, which at that point becomes an issue. It's post-treatment. So we have then contaminated our supply forever at that point. So my question to you is, what happens if arsenic does get to our groundwater supply?
If arsenic, if it's detected in the wells, there could be, one solution would be that they basically have to pump the water there at the fly ash pond. And they suck the water up and they treat the water before it gets to the utility company, okay? It's a pump and treat, it's called pump and treat system. And that's one of the more common ways of fixing a problem like that. And that could go on forever. I mean, they would be, the company that has, who's responsible for the landfill or the fly ash pond, they would be the ones that would be responsible for that as long as there's a problem, okay? It's called corrective action, groundwater corrective action. And that's one solution. Another solution, they put a slurry wall around the thing. A big giant mud wall, they just encircle it with a big old mud wall, and it's contained. You can't get through the mud wall. So that would be that would be super expensive, especially in this type of geologic environment where you got a lot of sand, but it could be done. Up in Indianapolis, they have a slurry wall around that landfill because they have problems. So that's another corrective measure that can happen. The facility would be responsible to investigate the different ways to correct the problem. We would look at that problem and we would say, okay, we agree this is probably the best way to correct that problem. Okay, it wouldn't be done like in an instant, but it would be done fairly quickly, and it may be that the company, whoever's responsible for the fly ash pond or the landfill, they would be responsible for supplying water to the people if need be. Okay, that'd be part of the corrective action process. So I'm not sure which geologist you talked to, or what if they had the full understanding of what you're asking. So. Okay.
Went over the entire map that we
Okay.
had. We discussed the problems, you know, with the fly ash ponds that did have liners, and the age of the liners that were in place, and also the clay wall.
Okay. Mm-hmm. But we would look at it, and we would be taking care of it the best that we know how. I'll let Jim talk.
Over here.
I was going
Hi, my name's Pam, and we keep talking about the fly ash, but there's another thing that I want to talk about. The stuff that you're burying on the ground, the stuff that's not ferrous or non-ferrous metals, the stuff that you can't sell off for, you know, that you're burying there. Is that being tested for things like the asbestos you said, or lead, things of that nature? Because I was at a town council meeting in Dillsboro, and we were told that I&M had to take the asbestos out before they ever vacated. Is that true? Was there some sort of something in place to move most of the asbestos before they?
No, when we took over the plant, it's our obligation to remove all the asbestos.
And that was mostly taken out at first?
That was all taken out prior to any demolition work, yes.
But now there's basements there that the asbestos was not taken out of?
No, that's not correct.
Okay, because in the meeting I went to.
Abatement of the entire facility.
And Matt, was that not what we heard at Dillsboro? That some of the materials in the basement were never touched?
Yeah, according to a former AEP employee, nothing was removed from the basement, everything was left in place.
Correct. Which, I mean, are we guaranteed there's not lead, there's not asbestos? Because our water's fine today, but what about 10, 15 years from now? What can you guarantee us? That's my concern.
Let me take that apart in some pieces. The asbestos was removed from the entire facility, from the lower basements to the very top. That was a complete abatement. We are not through with the demolition process. We still have work to do to clean out the basements, but prior to any type of demolition, all the materials, all the universal waste we talked about, all the oil and greases, all the sumps, all those all those areas were cleaned. So all of the environmental cleanup work, if you were, was done prior to demolition. There is today, we're not done with the demolition. That's obvious. We still have work ahead of us to go in and remove and finish the work in the basements to do the cleanup work for the demolition.
And who monitors what you're burying in the ground? I don't assume IDEM does that, correct?
That's, to a certain extent. I mean, that IDEM can come in and can monitor what we're doing. Again, we take the position that concrete and brick is clean, uncontaminated material that is best reused for the refill for filling, and again, within the basement structures, for filling some of those basement structures. That's a common demolition practice that's done throughout the U.S. to try to reuse those materials. It's no different than it's the concrete foundations that were in the ground to begin with.
Right.
If you think about it, we're breaking up the concrete foundations that were in the ground to begin with as part of the demolition process.
But you're not, I mean, there's no lead that we have to worry about, anything lead-based, anything? I mean, those are the things that concern me, down the road.
So the waste that is buried is waste that does not contain, in particular, lead. Let's talk about lead. Sometimes brick and concrete are not allowed to be buried on site if they have paint that has lead in it.
Correct. That was my concern.
Okay, and those wastes are taken off site. What we reuse is what is considered clean construction and demolition waste, clean C&D fill. It's called different things in different states. The standards sometimes vary, but they're pretty much consistent. And what we reuse is clean brick and concrete. Concrete is made of nothing more than rock that's been baked and mixed with some more rock and water, and brick's nothing more than mud. So we're just crushing it up and putting it back, which is why Russ has brought up that it's just as good as using virgin soil or virgin rock, except for it's on site, so you save the truck traffic and you have material there to fill in the basement holes, the voids that are left after you're done with the demolition, because when you're done, we want a level site so we can bring in most likely the ports and create a port or whatever other development takes place there.
And I understand that, but I'm just saying, is there anybody monitoring that? other than you, other than Tanner's Creek LLC?
Who does the inspections for the demolition permit?
That's probably a question for IDEM. Are you guys monitoring what they're burying in the ground?
So our solid waste compliance inspectors would be the people who could come out, especially if we received a complaint, to look at what they're doing. We haven't received any complaints to this point about materials, being managed inappropriately there. The authorities we're looking at right now revolve around closure of the fly ash pond, the main ash pond, and the restricted waste site landfill. The redevelopment of that area where the power plant buildings has been, there may be some work with some of our other programs that address remediation. We asked if they would be able to come with us tonight, and they were unavailable. But I'm not sure, what plans being done there. So if there are known problems, we can share those with our compliance inspectors, and they can come out and take a look and see if they find violations and pursue that. Right. So if you have information, we're talking about a former employee that had suspicions, that person can submit a complaint to us, and we can follow up on that. There are buildings being demolished. I guess a couple of things. The asbestos abatement is managed within our Office of Air Quality, and so they had to go through a process there. We have buildings being demolished all over the state. We do our best to monitor what's going on, but we certainly can't go in and inspect every building that's being demolished. So I think you do need to consider the location of those of that facility in relation to your groundwater or drinking water wells. Where that is, we've got a creek underneath it. There's a long time of travel there. I don't see a lot of concern there. Just kind of just thinking through that.
And going back to, and that brings up two good things. That one, that we did discuss that there are demolition inspections, and there are inspections that occur surrounding the demolition. Is that correct? Or maybe ELT could speak to that. And then the other one is just a general point that I think is important, and I think that this group really gets that. But anytime, see something, say something. Anytime anyone has a concern, and Rebecca will sign on to this point, call IDEM, email IDEM. You can even, Brian DeBueller, encourage people to reach out to the Army Corps of Engineers during a permitting phase. So, and also your local officials, always reach out, even if it's something that you're not 100% sure has validity. We've never reached out to IDEM and been greeted with anything other than taking it very seriously and taking action. So please do that. And then ELT, if you could speak to just how that demo process is inspected. I know we talked about it a little bit before, but I think they bring up a good question.
Prior to demolition, there's inspections done by independent consultants and contractors that we have no affiliation with whatsoever for hazardous waste inventory. Typically, they look for PCB containing materials, heavy metal containing materials, most particularly ACM or asbestos containing materials. They make a long report and list of that, and those are the items that have to be taken out, as Russ said, prior to demolition. So those items are all tested, their samples pulled, sent off to a laboratory, they're checked for whatever they may contain. If they're suspect, they're tested. And many times those tests come back negative. The ones that come back positive are inventoried and they're removed prior to demolition. That's done on pretty much every commercial industrial demolition project there is, especially the older sites like we have here. So that's very typical. In conjunction with that, we've had many agencies and interested parties do their own inspections, and we haven't had those concerns come up because we always address those concerns with the lead painted materials and things like that. And the asbestos abatement is documented, and there's reports and inspections done with that as well.
Thank you. You have a question over here.
I'm Jim Sechrist. I'm from Aurora. So we'd be mostly affected, I believe, because the water flows downstream, and Aurora and a lot of other little towns get their water from those wells. My question is, like the lady said here, 10 or 15 years down the line, we have arsenic or something in the water. Who pays for that?
If it is shown that the source of the contamination is one of the ash impoundments or the landfill, which will be constantly monitored through these wells, then we would be responsible for cleaning that up. Okay. But I would like to also add, these wells are positioned so that they have what they call early detection. So if there is a leak, it will be detected long before it reaches your water supply.
Are you bonded, or will there be a bond? Who would be responsible for that 10, 15 years down the line?
Depending upon the closure process, there is a financial insurance mechanism put into place. That financial assurance mechanism remains through the closure period. That can be in the form of a trust or a bond, or you can put up cash. There are many ways to do that, but there is a required financial assurance mechanism.
What would that require? Would that require a lot of deep wells going through a filter?
It's enough.
What would take the heavy metals out?
Okay, so what would it require to clean the water? That is very dependent upon the situation. That's a very hypothetical situation. As was referred to, if that situation should occur, then we would have to have a engineering analysis and design done for a cleanup approach. There are many different ways to clean that up. There are many different ways to treat water for heavy metals. We would have to, at that time, find out what would be most effective.
I just wanted to just follow up briefly on what was just mentioned, that as part of this closure process and as part of the post-closure care obligations, we are required to post what's called financial assurance, and that is posted with Indiana Department of Environmental Management. So there's going to be an obligation to post a fund to manage that 30-year post-closure care period. So that just to kind of reiterate that question, from your monitoring and maintenance from a groundwater standpoint, we have an obligation to post financial assurance with the state of Indiana.
What amount?
The amount is determined. There's a mechanism in place, and that's all part of the closure plans and the post-closure care. There's a mechanism.
It's all pretty expensive if you have to go to water treatment.
Well, the water treatment would be, a corrective action would be another step, but again, that's hypothetical that would have to go to get into that place. But just there is a financial assurance mechanism that will be in place.
I have a question. Sorry, I didn't realize that mic was that hot. Mean to overtalk there. I've spoken with Tim Maloney at HEC quite frequently in matters in the past. And I'm looking at their, it was released March 13th, 2018. It was kind of a study they had done on a lot of the different power plants in the state of Indiana. And one thing that I noticed, and I had talked at a previous city council meeting before, and I brought this question up, and nobody really had the answer. Has the materials at this site ever been tested for radioactivity or radium? Because I'm looking at this list of all these power plants that they tested, and Coley Generating System or Station in Warwick County. There's just a bunch of them here. Brown Generating Station in West Franklin, IPL Petersburg. There's several in here, but you do see radium popping up at some of these sites. And I was just curious if any of the materials here locally have ever been tested for radioactivity.
Do you want to try that?
Yeah, John,
The materials, I don't think that I know of haven't. Our waste analysis group when they do a waste classification, I don't think that's part of the waste classification testing for the materials. Now,
Right.
the groundwater will be tested for radium and such.
So
That's
the groundwater monitoring wells would show that?
If it's in the groundwater and they're using the proper testing methods to analyze the groundwater for that particular constituent, yes.
Okay, because I wasn't seeing it in the historical testing, but I didn't know if that was because it wasn't there or because it hadn't been tested for that. And then when I looked at that report from Hoosier Environmental Council, and it seemed to be kind of a recurring theme at some of the other plants around the state, and I didn't know, how does that get there? Is that radium, is that in the coal originally, or where does it come from? I mean, because it's obviously not a nuclear facility. What is the source of that radium that they're finding at these stations?
It could be part of the coal, the burn. On this particular site, for the groundwater, it hasn't been tested yet. The radium testing is part of the federal regulations.
The 2015.
And
right. I know this plant was exempted from that because they closed in 2014.
That's correct. But on their sampling list, that's part of the closure plan. They are proposing to test for that constituent.
Okay.
So they will be testing for it. The materials themselves, I have no idea if they've tested the materials for that.
I mean, out of all the bad stuff there, that's kind of, the one that rings a bell with everybody. I know boron can be an issue,
Yes.
and we've talked about that. I know Olin was speaking about that earlier with regard to, I know there's not the Safe Drinking Water Act doesn't establish a safe level for boron, but the World Health Organization does. Are there any plans going forward for IDEM wouldn't it be a good idea to be kind of forward thinking with that testing?
We do test for radium.
You do test for radium? Okay. Well, thanks. I've been asking that for a lot. I should have just called you.
Yeah, and real quick on your question on boron.
Sure.
That's part of their sampling, their sampling
sure.
constituent list, and they will be testing it, and we'll be looking at it. And if there is a problem with boron over what